For 3 seasons in the 1960s, a family called the Robinsons drifted through the galaxy in a silver saucer called the Jupiter 2, and millions of American children pressed themselves against television sets to watch them do it. What those children never saw, and what most fans still don't fully understand today, is what was happening just off camera. The quiet power struggles, the career sacrifices, the friendships that outlasted the show by 6 decades, and the losses that finally caught up with almost everyone involved. This is the story behind the story, built from what the cast and the people who worked alongside them said across nearly 60 years of interviews. By 2025, the Robinson family that once felt indestructible on screen had become something much smaller and much more human. Bill Mumy, who spent 4 years playing the boy genius Will Robinson, had grown into his 70s. Angela Cartwright, his on-screen sister Penny, was right behind him. Marta Kristen, who played the eldest daughter Judy, had passed 80. And June Lockhart, the actress who anchored the family as Mother Maureen Robinson, was still alive at 100 years old, having outlived nearly every other adult on the original call sheet. On October 23, 2025, Lockhart died of natural causes at her home in Santa Monica, with her daughter and granddaughter at her side. Her family said afterward that she would be remembered as a remarkable woman, mother, and grandmother, and her daughter noted that acting had always been Lockhart's craft, but her deeper passions ran toward journalism, science, and space exploration itself, which made her 36-episode run playing a fictional astronaut mother feel less like an accident and more like a strange kind of destiny. Lockhart's death closed a chapter that had already been quietly reopening for years, because in her final round of interviews, she had started talking more plainly than she ever had before about how coldly the show actually ended. There was no farewell dinner, no phone call from a studio executive thanking the cast for 3 years of work, no acknowledgement at all. The cancellation arrived as a small item buried in the entertainment pages of the morning paper. And that was the entirety of the send-off that CBS gave to one of the most watched science fiction programs on American television. Lockhart wasn't the only one carrying that memory. Bill Mumy, who was only 14 when the show ended, has said in multiple interviews over the years that the news reached him through his agent, delivered as a piece of business rather than a farewell, and that he went home afterward and cried. He had spent his last season on set believing a 4th year was already locked in. Then the network's renewal list came out, the Jupiter 2 wasn't on it, and a childhood that had been built entirely around that spaceship ended with a phone call. By the time the surviving Robinson children were finally speaking this openly about the show's cold ending, most of the men who had built it with them were already gone. Mark Goddard, who played the pilot Major Don West, died on October 10, 2023, in Hingham, Massachusetts, from pulmonary fibrosis, just days after celebrating his 87th birthday. Mumy posted a public tribute afterward, calling Goddard a beloved friend for nearly 60 years and noting that Goddard had sometimes felt boxed in by the campier side of the show even as he came to embrace it. Jonathan Harris, the actor who turned the villain Dr. Smith into the show's most beloved character, died in November 2002 at 87. Bob May, the man who spent 3 years sweating inside the robot costume, died in January 2009. Dick Tufeld, the voice of the robot, followed in January 2012. And yet, decades after all of that loss, the 3 surviving Robinson children keep finding their way back to each other. In March 2026, Mumy posted a photo of himself with Cartwright and Kristen, joking that Judy, Penny, and Will Robinson had been spotted together on Earth. 60 years after the show first aired, that habit of showing up for one another says more about what this production actually was than any of the spaceship props ever could. What almost nobody outside the production understood at the time was that the entire show had been quietly rewritten by a man who was supposed to be killed off within his first 5 episodes. And he pulled it off so completely that even the people whose careers he displaced eventually admitted it was a masterstroke. Before Jonathan Harris became Dr. Smith, he was a pharmacist's son raised in a crowded Bronx tenement, the child of Russian immigrant parents, who decided early in life that he intended to become an entirely different person than the one he'd been born as. He legally changed his surname from Karasukin to Harris at 17, against his father's objections, earned a pharmacy degree he had no intention of ever using, invented an acting resume out of thin air, and talked his way into a career that eventually included Broadway, an appearance on The Twilight Zone, and something in the neighborhood of 125 stage productions. When Irwin Allen offered him the role of Dr. Zachary Smith on Lost in Space, Harris looked at the character on the page and recognized immediate danger. As written, Smith was a cold, calculating saboteur who murders a guard in the pilot and reprograms the robot to kill the Robinson family in their sleep, a character designed to be despised and written out within his first handful of episodes. Harris understood exactly what that meant for his career. A role that ends after 5 episodes isn't a role, it's a trap. So he began quietly rewriting the character. He would arrive on set with pages of new dialogue he'd written the night before and tell his fellow actors they needed to go over the scene again because he'd changed it. Bill Mumy, a child at the time, watched this happen and later described it with genuine admiration. Harris would rework a scene and then engineer the physical staging so that every beat of the action funneled back toward Smith. None of the cowardly hand-wringing, the theatrical complaints about his back, or the endless stream of inventive insults aimed at the robot ever existed in the original scripts. Harris built those insults himself night after night, phrases built for maximum comic rhythm, explaining his logic plainly. The robot could see through Smith's schemes, so Smith had to keep attacking it to keep it from exposing him. And every insult doubled as a survival tactic dressed up as comedy. By the time Irwin Allen fully grasped what had happened, the show was reportedly receiving hundreds of fan letters a month specifically about Dr. Smith, and Allen had no real option left but to embrace it publicly. He later credited Harris directly, acknowledging that the character had shifted from villain to comic centerpiece because Harris had essentially dictated the direction himself. Harris also negotiated a special guest star credit that ran across all 83 episodes, reportedly among the earliest uses of that specific billing arrangement on American television. But that public triumph came at a private cost to the man who had been hired to be the show's actual hero. Guy Williams arrived on Lost in Space as one of the more recognizable faces on American television, having spent 4 years playing Zorro for Disney. He was tall, trained in fencing since childhood, and genuinely excited to play John Robinson, the family's brilliant mission commander. This was supposed to be his show. Instead, the transformation happened gradually enough to feel almost polite. In the first season, his screen time began shrinking as the Dr. Smith storylines expanded to fill the space. By the second season, it had become a clear pattern, and by the third, it was simply the accepted shape of the production. Williams would appear, deliver a handful of lines, and stand in the background while Harris, Mumy, and the robot carried the story. Mark Goddard described the shift plainly in later interviews, saying the show had drifted toward the robot and Smith and that there were real hard feelings from Williams about it. Harris himself acknowledged the damage he'd caused, noting that Williams had been hired to be the star of the series and ended up with barely a line every other week, a situation Harris called genuinely difficult for any actor to sit through, even though he was the one causing it. Williams reportedly filled his idle hours on set with classical music, astronomy books, chess, and stock trading, and Mumy nicknamed him the Comb for his habit of grooming himself constantly between takes. Long after the show ended, Williams discovered his career at home hadn't survived being pushed into the background of his own series. But on the other side of the world, the opposite had happened. Zorro had become a genuine cultural touchstone in Argentina, and Williams spent much of the rest of his life living there, embraced by a country that had never lost its affection for him. On May 6, 1989, police entered his Buenos Aires apartment after friends reported that he hadn't been seen in some time, and found that he had died alone roughly a week earlier of a ruptured brain aneurysm. He was 65. Mumy later said simply that once the show ended, he never saw Williams again, not once. While Williams was slowly disappearing from his own storylines, another member of the cast was enduring something far more physically dangerous, and the production treated it as an inconvenience rather than a hazard. Bob May reportedly wandered into the Lost in Space audition almost by accident while trying out for a different job at the studio, and Irwin Allen's team sent him to test the robot suit simply because he happened to fit inside it. The costume weighed close to 200 pounds, was nearly airtight, and turned into what May later described as a jacuzzi and a sauna combined the moment the studio lights came on. Across the show's 3 seasons, May reportedly lost consciousness inside the suit on at least 2 occasions from lack of oxygen before crew members even realized something was wrong, and filming typically continued regardless. May was also a habitual smoker, and June Lockhart recalled watching cigarette smoke drift out through the robot's scenes between takes, a detail that, as the story goes, once caused Irwin Allen to panic that the costume was on fire, only to discover May was simply having a cigarette break inside it. Despite performing virtually every physical gesture that made the robot beloved, May reportedly went uncredited on screen for the entire original run, a fact that also meant lower pay and reduced residuals, as the show grew into a long-running franchise. Years later, in November 2008, the Sayre fire destroyed the mobile home where May and his wife were living in the San Fernando Valley. 2 months after that, May died of congestive heart failure at 69. What defined his later years wasn't bitterness, but generosity. He became a fixture on the science fiction convention circuit, known for staying at his signing table until every last fan had gotten their moment with him. None of this, the robot, Dr. Smith's transformation, or the family's slow drift into camp, was part of Irwin Allen's original vision. Before any of it existed, Allen had produced a much more serious pilot film, and the network buried it before audiences ever saw it in its intended form. That original film, titled No Place to Hide, was shot in late 1964 on a budget of roughly $600,000, reportedly making it the most expensive televi. Reportedly cost more than the far more famous bridge of the Enterprise on Star Trek, and scored by a young composer named Johnny Williams, later known simply as John Williams, the man who would go on to write the music for Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones. That connection to Star Trek wasn't a coincidence, because the two shows spent years locked in a rivalry that most fans still misunderstand. In the ratings, it was never close. Lost in Space regularly finished in the low 30s in the weekly Nielsen rankings, while Star Trek, during its original run, rarely cracked the top 50. The show, remembered today as the defining science fiction series of the 1960s, was, at the time, losing the ratings race every single week. The rivalry began before either show existed. Gene Roddenberry had pitched Star Trek to CBS first, and the network's detailed interest in his production plans was really about protecting Lost in Space, which the network was already developing. CBS passed. Roddenberry took the show to NBC instead, and the two series spent 3 seasons quietly competing for the same audience without ever sharing a time slot. Their production crews weren't nearly as hostile toward one another as fans assumed. In one memorable case during Lost in Space's 3rd season, the makeup department needed pointed ears for an alien character, and, pressed for both time and budget, borrowed the actual molds used to create Spock's ears, repainted to a different color. Observant Star Trek fans noticed, and accused the rival show of copying them, when the real explanation was simply that makeup artists on both productions were friends who shared resources to survive impossible schedules. Inside the Jupiter 2 itself, a real relationship was unfolding alongside the fictional one. Angela Cartwright was 13 and Bill Mumy was 10 when filming began, and the two went through their entire adolescence together on that set, tutored side by side at the studio school. Mumy has described their bond in interviews as each other's first real love, and the two were briefly engaged in the early 1970s before ending the relationship without bitterness. More than 50 years later, they remain genuinely close, having co-authored books together and continuing to appear together at conventions well into 2026. Mumy also carried his own quiet secret. While spending his workdays on a show marketed as Star Trek's rival, he was, by his own account, a devoted fan of Star Trek at Home, a connection he eventually made official decades later with a guest appearance on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, playing a Starfleet officer who dies in the episode. Irwin Allen died on November 2, 1991. Gene Roddenberry had died just 9 days earlier, on October 24th. The two men who spent their careers competing for the same corner of American science fiction left the world within the same 2-week span. The ending of Lost in Space remains one of the more instructive stories in television history about how the industry treats the people who build it. The show ran 83 episodes across 3 seasons and never received a real finale. The Robinsons were never rescued, never reached Alpha Centauri, and never came home. The final episode filmed left the family still